Chapter 10. Previously, after Elias Thorne publicly dismantled Arthur Vane's security monopoly by overclocking their junkyard hardware, the victory was immediately undercut when Elena Vance revealed she sabotaged their capacitor supply chain. This betrayal shifts the conflict from a corporate rivalry to a lethal personal threat as the team faces catastrophic hardware instability and a new enemy hierarchy. Now, Chapter 10 begins. The hum of the Aether Core workshop usually sounded like a lullaby to Elias Thorne, a steady drone of cooling fans and electrical current that signaled life. Tonight, it sounded like a countdown. Kenji Sato stood before the main server bay, his face bathed in the harsh red glow of a thermal imaging overlay. He didn't look up as Elias and Maya approached. His fingers flew across the haptic interface with a speed that betrayed rising panic. "Lot 404 is cooking," Kenji said, his voice tight. "Not normal operating heat. This is exponential. Look at the delta." Elias leaned over Kenji's shoulder. On the screen, the cluster of industrial capacitors scavenged from Elena Vance's supply chain was bleeding infrared radiation. The temperature curve wasn't linear, it was vertical. In 3 minutes, the casing would melt. In 5, the electrolyte inside would flash vaporize, turning the entire rack into a shrapnel bomb. "Isolate Unit 4, Elias ordered, his voice cutting through the ambient noise. "Hard disconnect, don't touch the bus bars." Kenji engaged the magnetic clamps, severing the connection before the heat could propagate. With a hiss of escaping gas, the offending capacitor was pulled from the rack. It sat on the workbench, sweating condensation despite the room's climate control. Elias picked up a precision laser cutter. "Maya, pull the supply chain logs for this batch. Cross-reference the serials against Elena's vendor list. I want to know who touched these before they reached us." On it, Maya slid into her terminal, fingers dancing across the keyboard to decrypt ledgers. "Tracing? Okay, the invoice says Vane Dynamics surplus, but the subcomponent metadata tells a different story. These aren't surplus. They're military grade. Specifically, they match the signature of a subsidiary Vane uses for Black Ops hardware disposal." Elias didn't wait. He activated the laser, slicing the aluminum casing of the capacitor with surgical precision. As the outer shell fell away, revealing the tightly wound foil and dielectric layers inside, he zoomed in with a magnifying lens attached to his rig. There, buried deep within the winding, invisible to the naked eye and undetectable by standard multimeters, was a microscopic filament bridge. It connected the primary anode directly to a remote triggerable fuse element. "It's not a defect," Elias whispered, the realization settling in his gut like cold lead. "It's a backdoor. Someone designed this to trigger thermal runaway specifically during high-load operations. If we had run the stress test, Sila's demanded yesterday." "The workshop would be a crater," Maya finished, her voice trembling. She looked up, eyes wide with a mixture of horror and fury. "Elena didn't just try to starve us out, Elias. She planted a bomb in our infrastructure. She wanted us dead, and she wanted it to look like an accident caused by our own incompetence." The air in the room shifted. The fear of failure evaporated, replaced by a sharp, crystalline rage. This wasn't business anymore. This was attempted murder disguised as venture capital due diligence. "She thinks we're helpless," Elias said, setting the dissected capacitor down with deliberate care. "She thinks we're just engineers who break when the pressure gets too high." "Elias," Kenji warned, pointing back at the thermal display. "The rest of the lot is still active. If the signal triggers remotely, we lose the whole array." "Let her try," Elias said, a dark smile touching his lips. "But first, we need to talk to our benefactor." The secure comms room was a small box of silence in the chaotic workshop. When the video call came through, Elena Vance's face filled the holoscreen. She looked immaculate, dressed in a sharp charcoal suit, sipping tea in a sun-drenched office miles away from their grimy reality. "Elias," she said, her tone dripping with feigned concern. My sensors are picking up alarming instability in your power grid. Thermal spikes, voltage fluctuations. It looks like those recycled components are failing under the load. Elias slumped in his chair, rubbing his temples. He let his shoulders drop, projecting an image of exhaustion and defeat. It's bad, Elena. Worse than we thought. The capacitors are overheating. We're looking at a total system meltdown within the hour. I don't know if we can salvage the demo. Elena nodded slowly, a predator sensing blood in the water. I was afraid of this. Using e-waste was a gamble, and unfortunately, it seems you've lost. But don't worry, Elias. I can send a compliance team immediately. They'll inspect the hardware, replace the faulty units with certified Vane Dynamics parts, and ensure safety protocols are met. At no cost to you, of course. We can't have your little startup burning down the block. It was a perfect trap. A compliance team entering the facility would seize the ghost server data under the guise of a safety inspection. They would wipe the drives, confiscate the evidence of Vane's illegal AI projects, and leave Aether Core bankrupt and liable for negligence. Maya, sitting just out of frame, tapped a silent rhythm on her knee. On her secondary monitor, a trace route completed. The call wasn't coming from Elena's office. It was bouncing through a shell company registered to Arthur Vane, the founder himself. That would be incredible, Elias stammered, injecting just enough desperation into his voice to sell the performance. We're drowning here, Elena. Please, send the team. We can't stop the cascade on our own. Consider it done, Elena said, her smile not reaching her eyes. They'll be there in 20 minutes. Try not to blow yourselves up before they arrive. The screen went dark. Elias straightened instantly, the slump vanishing. 20 minutes. She believes the puppet strings are still intact. She traced the call to Arthur Vane, Maya reported, her voice low. This isn't just Elena. The founder is watching. Good, Elias said, standing up. Let's give him a show he won't forget. Kenji, meet me in the fabrication lab. We aren't removing those capacitors. Kenji raised an eyebrow. We are. No, Elias said, walking briskly toward the door. We're going to weaponize them. The fabrication lab was a maze of soldering irons, scrap metal, and half-finished prototypes. Elias and Kenji worked with a synchronized intensity born of years of shared crisis. They didn't dismantle the sabotaged capacitor cluster. Instead, they built around it. Bypass the thermal fuses, Elias directed, handing Kenji a roll of superconducting tape. Reroute the potential explosion energy. We need to channel the discharge into a localized Faraday cage. I can build the cage from the scrap shielding we pulled from the old MRI machine, Kenji said, already measuring cuts. But if that fuse blows, the energy density will be off the charts. It'll fry everything within 10 feet. Not if we give it somewhere to go, Elias replied. He moved to the Junkyard GPU cluster, a chaotic assembly of mismatched graphics cards held together by zip ties and hope. We're going to overclock these to maximum capacity. We'll use the bomb capacitors as unstable voltage regulators. Kenji paused, the plasma cutter hovering inches from the metal sheet. You want to feed a controlled explosion into an overclocked system? Elias, that's suicide. The feedback loop could vaporize the silicon. It's only suicide if we try to stabilize it, Elias corrected, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of calculation. The sabotage relies on a specific thermal threshold to trigger the remote receiver. If we push the system past that threshold intentionally, if we burn out the receivers with pure excess energy before the remote signal can execute the command, we blindfold them. We turn their kill switch into a power source. Kenji stared at him for a second, then grinned. It was a reckless, insane plan. It was exactly why he followed Elias. Right. Turn the death sentence into an engine. Let's do it. They worked in a frenzy. Wires were stripped, circuits bridged, and the Faraday cage welded shut around the volatile capacitor bank. The hum of the workshop grew louder, deeper, vibrating in their chests as the system began to draw power. The capacitors began to glow a dull, angry orange. Thermal spike detected, Kenji called out. Receivers are heating up. They're trying to handshake with the remote server. Hold it, Elias commanded, his hands flying over the kernel console. Push the voltage. Give them more than they can handle. He slammed the enter key. The GPUs screamed as they hit 150% capacity. The orange glow of the capacitors turned white-hot. Alarms blared, warning of imminent critical failure. Now, Elias shouted. The surge hit. Instead of exploding outward, the energy was sucked into the Faraday cage, channeled through the modified bus bars, and fed directly into the GPU cluster. The remote receivers inside the capacitors, overwhelmed by the sudden, massive influx of unregulated current, fused instantly. The link to Elena's control server snapped. The lights in the workshop flickered and died, then surged back on, brighter than before. The system stabilized, humming with a terrifying new power. Receivers are fried, Kenji confirmed, checking the diagnostics. Signal lost, they're blind. Elias wiped sweat from his forehead. Perfect, now let's go live. The public tech forum livestream had millions of viewers. The chat scrolled so fast it was a blur of emojis and speculation. In the center of the virtual stage, Elias Thorne stood before his jury-rigged rig, the white-hot glow of the modified capacitors visible even through the camera feed. A pre-recorded statement from Silas Vane played on the main screen behind him. Silas looked smug, leaning back in his leather chair. It is tragic to watch talented individuals fail due to a lack of proper resources, Silas said smoothly. Aether Core's reliance on e-waste was always a liability. We predict imminent catastrophic failure within minutes. Safety first, folks. The audience laughed. The sentiment was clear. Elias was done. Ladies and gentlemen, Elias announced, his voice amplified across the digital space. Welcome to the stress test of the Aether Core entropy kernel. Today, we don't just survive the load, we eat it. He flipped the master switch. On screen, the capacitors flared brilliant red. Warning icons flashed across the broadcast overlay. Critical temperature. System failure imminent. Silas's smirk widened, and there it goes. But the explosion never came. Instead, the cluster absorbed the thermal spike. The modified circuit engaged, converting the violent release of energy into a massive, concentrated burst of compute power. The fans spun into a deafening roar, but the system held. Entropy kernel engaged, Elias declared, redirecting excess thermal energy to decryption protocols. On the public display, a progress bar appeared. It wasn't testing stability. It was attacking the Vane military AI drive they had stolen. The raw, chaotic power of the bomb capacitors provided the brute force needed to crack the secondary encryption layer in real time. Decrypting. 98%. 99%. 100%. The screen flashed green. A document dumped onto the public feed, scrolling rapidly for everyone to see. It was a ledger. Not just any ledger, but a list of Vane Dynamics, illegal offshore accounts, detailing bribes to regulatory officials and funding for unauthorized autonomous weapons programs. The names, dates, and amounts were crystal clear. The chat stopped scrolling, then it exploded. What is this? Those are Vane's accounts. He cracked it live. Silas lied, the system didn't fail. Silas's pre-recorded message cut out, replaced by a frantic technical difficulties slate. But it was too late. The data was out. The explosion had become a data dump that exposed the rot at the heart of Vane Dynamics. Elias stood amidst the rising smoke of the fried capacitors, the smell of ozone thick in the air. He looked directly into the camera. Resilience isn't about avoiding the fire, he said quietly. It's about learning how to burn without turning to ash. The workshop was silent again, save for the crackle of cooling metal. Smoke drifted lazily toward the ceiling vents. The capacitors were ruined, blackened husks, but the servers were intact. More than intact, they were victorious. Maya walked over to Elias, handing him a bottle of water. Her hands were shaking, but she was smiling. Stock price just dropped 12%, she said, and climbing. The SEC has already issued a statement saying they're opening an investigation based on the leaked documents. Elias took a long drink, and Elena. As if on cue, a notification pinged on Maya's tablet. A terse message from Elena Vance. "You play dirty, Mr. Thorne." Elias chuckled dryly. He typed a reply, attaching the schematic of the sabotaged capacitor they had dissected earlier. He tagged it with Elena's firm's logo and added a single line, "Restitution. All frozen assets plus 20% interest. Immediate transfer. Or I forward this schematic to the insurance adjusters with a note about corporate terrorism." He hit send. They waited. The tension in the room was palpable, heavier than the smoke. If she refused, they'd have to fight a legal war on top of the physical one. If she complied, it meant admission of guilt, but it also meant survival. 3 minutes later, a chime echoed through the workshop. "Funds received," Kenji announced, staring at his banking app. "Full amount plus the interest." Elias exhaled, the adrenaline finally beginning to fade, leaving him bone-tired. She couldn't risk the exposure. Admitting to the hardware tampering is bad, but being caught trying to cover up a bombing is career-ending. "We did it," Maya said, leaning her head against his shoulder. "We actually did it." "For now," Elias murmured, looking at the blackened remains of the capacitors. "We neutralized Elena, we humiliated Silas, but we made a lot of enemies tonight." Kenji suddenly stiffened. "Wait, I'm seeing something else." He pointed to the transaction log. Buried in the metadata of the restitution transfer was an encrypted packet. It hadn't come from Elena's server. The encryption signature was different, older, heavier, infinitely more dangerous. "Origin?" Elias asked, stepping forward. "Arthur Vane," Kenji said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "The founder." Elias felt a chill that had nothing to do with the workshop's temperature. He nodded to Kenji to decrypt the header. A single coordinate appeared on the screen, along with a timestamp for tomorrow night. Below it, a short message. "You have my attention. Come alone, or I release the unedited footage of your workshops, accidental, fire, risk to the insurance adjusters. They love a good fraud case." Elias stared at the coordinates. The game had changed again. Elena was a player, Silas was a pawn, but Arthur Vane was the board itself. "Tomorrow night," Elias said softly. Maya gripped his arm. "Elias, you can't go alone, it's a trap." "I know," he said, his eyes fixed on the glowing map. "But if we don't go, we lose everything we just won." He looked at his team, battered but unbowed. "Get some rest, we have a date with the devil." In the next chapter, as the orbital invitation burns into his comms, Elias realizes that Arthur Vane's final trap isn't a server, but the one person he can never afford to lose.